Hi, welcome back to the Story By podcast. Thanks for stopping by. Today's episode, Startling Fish, is an early unpublished piece that I dug out and fiddled with to release for the show. That may not seem like high praise, but it appealed to me, because as I get older, I begin to appreciate the protagonist Donovan's desire to be left the hell alone. Though I wouldn't go to the same extremes. Anyway, before I spoil things, I should probably just get into the story. I'll talk to you in a little bit, after you've had a chance to listen to Startling Fish. A dragonfly danced across the glassy green surface of the pond. Donovan ignored the movement and kept his eye on the drifting bobber. The small red and white plastic globe bounced occasionally, carried by a stray ripple, as a frog plopped into the water. Donovan shifted slightly, changing his position against a log, and easing the eternal ache in his shoulder. The bullet that mangled the joint so badly always seemed to be there, a hot chunk of lead, a permanent souvenir of his days in the service of his country. It was an illusion, of course. The bullet had long since been removed by an army surgeon, but its ghost remained. Donovan saw the bobber dip again, then submerge. With a swift, noiseless jerk, he set the hook and began to reel in his catch. He rose slightly from his position to draw the fish from the water. He extended his left hand, the one with the puckered scar of a knife slash, a gift from an East German, back when there were still East Germans. Donovan hauled the fish from the pond and appraised the creature. Smaller than he preferred, but still worth frying. He unhooked the fish and dropped it into a bucket to join its two comrades in the cramped, watery container that would be their final swimming hole. He dug around in his bait can, drawing out another worm. Glancing into the can, he noticed he was nearly out of bait. He sighed, knowing that his fishing day was almost up. With a gentle cast, he flicked the hook into the water and leaned back against the log. If Donovan had been the type of person who dozed, he would have. The mid-afternoon sun warmed the still air, and the secluded fishing hole was far from the sounds of traffic and people. A string quartet was playing something quiet and soothing, though only in Donovan's mind. He would never bring radio with him out to this silent spot. The bobber had just begun the seductive little dance that signals an impending strike, when something crashed to the ground in the timber several yards away. Then a male voice yelled, "Fuck!" The bobber dipped, then popped to the surface, and bounced along on the expanding circle of ripples. Donovan gritted his teeth and reeled the line back to shore. The hook came from the water, empty of both bait and fish. Donovan glared toward the source of the noise in the timber. As he listened, he heard the approaching racket of an inexperienced idiot tramping through brush. After a full minute of cracking, crunching, and swearing, a man emerged from the tree line, wiping his reddened face with a monogrammed handkerchief. "It's fucking hot out here," the man bellowed, spotting Donovan. "How can you stand it?" Donovan shrugged. He had always tolerated temperature extremes. They rarely bothered him, and he never understood other people's discomfort in them. Perhaps it had been the result of living in the old farmhouse most of his life. Hot as hell in the summer, colder than the poles in the winter, no air conditioning, only a wood-burning stove for heat. It had enabled him to spend hours in weather of any kind, lying still and silent. First, to kill game, so his brothers and sisters could eat. Then, to kill men for his country. "Name's Bob," the man said, though Donovan hadn't asked. "Bob Gates." Donovan knew it was pointless to try and catch anything as long as Bob was around. The man's voice would have startled all the fish away from this area of the pond. If the man's voice wasn't enough, his clothes had their own screeching language as well. A wide floppy hat covered Bob's head, one not unlike the boonie hats Donovan had worn during his years in the jungle. However, rather than tiger-striped camouflage, Bob's hat was bright, glaring white, with a sweat-darkened, fluorescent pink hatband. Bob wore a matching fluorescent pink tank top tucked into bright blue exercise pants, which had a stained hole in each knee. The pants were the kind that people rarely seemed to actually exercise in, perhaps because of the plastic swishing noises that accompany every movement. On his back he wore the small frameless pack often carried on day hikes, usually loaded with water, snacks, and not much else. Donovan glanced toward Bob's feet. His high-top shoes had once been white with faux-pink laces, though they were now brown and green depending on what he dragged his foot through or tripped on as he crashed into Donovan's fishing spot. And Donovan did think of it as his. To the best of his knowledge, no living human being knew of this spot. He made sure of that. He wanted one place in his life where he didn't have to watch over his shoulder, avoiding discovery by somebody he'd pissed off when there was still an official Cold War. As Donovan's hand reached for the last worm in the can, Bob said, "So, doing some fishing?" Donovan nodded. "Quiet little place." Donovan nodded again. "Say, you haven't seen any other hikers, have you?" Donovan shook his head and impaled his last worm with the fishhook. "Damn it! I bet those bastards left me out here." Donovan flicked the line into the water. He knew it was pointless, as long as this braying ass was here, but it gave his hands something to do. "See," Bob continued, sitting on the end of the log that Donovan rested against, "I'm out hiking with some of the guys from my firm. I'm with Winker, Peck, and Shale." When Donovan didn't respond, Bob said, "You know, that law firm that handled the case with the corporate exec and the... Anyway, Bob trailed off when he realized that Donovan was looking out at the pond. "Anyway, a bunch of us juniors were taking a break after climbing the rock wall at the gym when Joey says, 'How about we try that survival camping?'" Bob paused, waiting for a response. Donovan flicked the pole slightly and the bobber wiggled. Bob shook his head and continued, "You know, no tents, no sleeping bags, just some food, water, and your survival skills. Real back-to-nature stuff." Bob paused, nudged Donovan. "You look like you've seen some action. Been in the Army?" Donovan sighed and nodded. "I knew it! You know what it's all about." After 10 years in uniform, and another 10 working out of uniform for other branches of the government, Donovan did know what it was about. And it wasn't day-glow warm-up suits and rock walls in a gym. He decided to listen to Beethoven for a while. Something loud to drown out the intruder. As Ode to Joy began to play in Donovan's mental jukebox, he heard Bob say, "So we come out to these godforsaken backwoods, park Joey's expedition by this beat-up piece of crap Jeep-looking thing, and we head into the woods. Now, we're supposed to stick together in the woods, right? Buddy up and all that?" Donovan nodded, hoping that would be enough to satisfy the man. It had been a long time since he'd had even a buddy, let alone one that he would bring to his haven in the woods. "So 15 minutes into the woods, I look over and Pete's my buddy, Pete's disappeared. I yell, 'Hey, Pete's lost!' Then I realize I'm on my own. Pete's not lost. They all are." The bobber dipped and resurfaced, then floated serenely again. Donovan sighed and considered whether to pack it in. "So here I am. I'm thinking these guys are all lost. Now I gotta go find them, so I start looking around trying to track them." The chorus had just begun to sing in Donovan's mind, and for a second actually drowned out the lawyer's drivel. Then as the finale died away, the man broke in again. "Well, it's been nice chatting with you, but I better go find those guys before they panic. Of course, knowing them, they blindly wandered back to the SUV and they're waiting around bitching about me like I'm the one who got lost." The lawyer rose and stretched. After he finished, he surveyed the fishing hole. "This is a pretty nice place. It's so quiet." Donovan nodded and reeled in his empty hook. Bob continued to look around as Donovan packed his gear. "Fishing good?" Donovan shrugged. "When I find the guys, I'll have to bring them back here. It's a peaceful little hideaway. Great place to bring the girls. Have a party." Donovan sighed and drew out his fillet knife. Hours later, Donovan emerged from the woods and saw an SUV the size of a battleship parked beside his trusty Scout. The monstrous vehicle nearly filled the dead-end cut in the woods that Donovan cleared out periodically as a parking place. He shook his head and lifted the full fish bucket into the back of the Scout. The water sloshed slightly as nearly a dozen fish wrestled in the container. Donovan then placed the nearly full bait can next to the fish bucket. Finally, he unslung the fishing pole's tubular case from his shoulder and tossed it into the back of the Scout. Taking a few minutes, he made a couple circuits around the little truck, checked under the body and under the hood. When he was confident that nothing had been tampered with, he stepped up to climb into the driver's seat. Then he heard rustling in the tree line, and a male voice yelled, "Excuse me, sir." Donovan sighed and stepped away from the Scout. A trio of men came panting up to the side of Donovan's truck, and one of them said, "Have you seen a guy about this tall wearing a backpack? Lots of pink and blue?" Donovan pondered the description for a second, then shook his head. "I knew that idiot would get lost," another of the men said. "He couldn't find his ass." "Hey!" the third responded. "Enough already. He could be hurt. Lying there bleeding." "Both of you shut it," the first speaker barked. "You sure you didn't see Bob?" Donovan nodded. "You have any idea where we could look for him?" Donovan shrugged, then pretended to think about it. "River's over that way." He pointed in the opposite direction of his fishing hole. "People get lost, wander around here. They usually head toward the sound of the river." "Thanks a lot, man." Donovan nodded and got into the Scout. He waited till the trio headed off in the direction he'd indicated, then started the engine. As he watched them disappear into the woods, he wondered how long it would be until their bodies were found. He had baited the trap with some of the swishy fabric from the first idiot's suit. If Bob was any example of the outdoor skills his friends had, they would all be dead in the river within an hour, and they'd be found a long ways from his fishing hole. When the news furor died down, he would return to his silent spot. Donovan was a patient man. He could wait. I don't really have anything else to say about this one. It was another story that struggled to find a home, partly, I suspect, because no one was sure what to do with it. Because so much of it is Donovan's self-reflection and internal musing, I don't know that it would translate very well to the screen. But if you think you have a brilliant way to make it work, then by all means get in touch. The show's email is storybypodcast@gmail.com. Facebook is facebook.com/storybypodcast. And, of course, Twitter is @storybypodcast. All those links and more are on the show notes page, storybypodcastblog.wordpress.com. That should wrap it up for today. I hope you come back next week for another episode of the Story by Podcast. Thanks, as always, for stopping by. I really appreciate it. Story by Podcast is a production of Fiddling Around Productions, LLC, and copyright 2018. Theme music is provided by Nalani Proctor at nalaniproctor.com and used with permission.